be with you in person, I want to take this opportunity to welcome our good friend, Rabbi Brant Rosen, to lead your conversation. Rabbi Rosen is well known to many in our synod for his clear and passionate advocacy for justice. This is also an opportunity for me to thank our own working group on the Middle East Peace for their faithful leadership in bringing these issues to our attention. Although we regularly receive messages of despair and stories of cruelty and violence coming from the Middle East, our working group has continued to present messages of hope and nonviolent engagement. I pray for God's Spirit to guide your conversation today and your work. In Christ, Bishop Wayne Miller. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. And I'm Joe Scarry from St. Luke's. Thank you all for being here today. I feel like we could go on for quite a long time introducing Brant Rosen, and so I'm going to do a very quick introduction. As many of you know, he's a congregational rabbi here in the Chicago area at the Reconstructionist Temple in Evanston. As you, I think, all also know, he's an author of a wonderful book called Wrestling in the Daylight. We'll be talking about that today. We do have copies for sale for just $15. And you know, one of the first things that I learned when I heard Rabbi Brant speak was that this book grows out of a blog that he does. And when he talked, he spoke about the hundreds of people who engage with him on the blog. And as somebody who myself writes a blog, I said, wow, that's really unusual. What a great accomplishment. And so he is somebody who is in dialogue with people all around the world. I hear from people that I know in New York and other places when I say that I'm starting to work on some of these issues of peace and justice in Israel-Palestine. They will say, Joe, there's somebody that you need to know. I say, who is it? They say, Brant Rosen. So we're so pleased that he's here. The last thing that I want to say is that Rabbi Brant raises up for us an example of what it means to be active for justice in the public square. And if someone were to ask me, what is he like? I'd say this is someone who is like Tom Joad in Grapes of Wrath. Remember that thing where he's talking to his mom? And he says, Mom, wherever there's a fight, I'll be there. And when I think back over the last year, I've seen Rabbi Brant walking down in a march down Clark Street after there had been bombings of Gaza. Rabbi Brant was there. At the Council on American Islamic Relations, when a group came back from the West Bank and was reporting, Rabbi Brant was there. When there was a big Martin Luther King Day rally down on 95th Street, and many of us went down, Rabbi Brant was there. So we are very grateful for his example, and we're very grateful that he can join us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, and thank you to the Working Group on the Middle East Peace. Thank you to St. Luke's, and thank you to all of you for coming out today on this yet another chilly Sunday afternoon. I'm very humbled that you're here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Is it okay if I sit, or would it be easy? Okay. So I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then I really want to open it up for conversation, because that's really, the book really is a conversation. As Joe mentioned, it is an anthology of blog posts that I wrote over a 2-year period, but it includes a lot of the comments to those posts as well. And this was during a very critical 2-year period for me, in which I was really struggling myself very publicly with my relationship to Israel and the nature of my activism over Israel-Palestine. And one of the heartening things I found during that time was that even though I began with some uncertainty that I could continue to do this, to continue to serve as a rabbi, given the way my positions had evolved, I found that not only that I could, but I could really engage people. Not that necessarily everybody would agree with me. As you read the book, or if you read the book, you'll see there are very pointed conversations there. But it gives me hope to know that we can have the conversation. And so I thought after, few years after this period, as I continued to write the blog, and I sort of settled into the new normal of my own activism, that during that period, there was just some amazing stuff on my blog, just amazing conversations. People were talking to me, they ended up talking to each other. Many of them were people I knew. Some were my congregants, some were friends, some were Israelis and Palestinians, and many were people I didn't even know and probably will never know. But it opened up this amazing conversation that I found very heartening and very hopeful. And so the book is really just a little snapshot of that conversation. And I use the book when I do these kinds of readings as a way of as a tool to have these conversations together, face to face. So I'll speak for a little bit, and then and I'll read a little bit from the book, and then I would really love to open it up and hear from you. I'm also going to do a little bit of reading from this newer work called Zionism Unsettled that some of you may be familiar with. It was put out by IPMN, the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church. It's a study guide that is based on an anthology that's coming out this summer on Zionism. And I contributed a chapter to that anthology, and a lot of that chapter is excerpted in this book, which is starting to attract some attention. I don't know if you follow such things, but Zionism Unsettled is a very powerful work, and I hope that it will be used as a congregational study guide, not just in Presbyterian churches, but in churches and synagogues, quite frankly. And so in that essay, I explore, it's different than my book. I explore an approach to Jewish theology that would be a kind of Jewish liberation theology. And that would be different it would be depart from many of the assumptions that I think Jewish theology has ingrained since the birth of the State of Israel. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but I hope we'll be able to maybe engage in some of that conversation as well. So I want to start with just reading from the introduction to the book. I start by quoting Genesis 32:25, which is the Genesis 32, among other things, includes the incident with Jacob wrestling with the mysterious night stranger. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him at the break of dawn, until the break of dawn. This well-known biblical episode leaves beside tantalizing questions. Who is this mysterious man with whom Jacob wrestles? What is his identity, and where did he come from? One popular interpretation suggests that the night stranger with whom Jacob struggles at this critical moment is none other than Jacob himself, perhaps his alter ego or his shadow self. But why must the wrestling match necessarily take place at night? Why does the night stranger say so desperately to Jacob in the next verse, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking"? Perhaps this detail is teaching us that our deepest struggles invariably occur in the most private of places. After all, whenever we publicly wrestle with our deepest dilemmas, doubts, or fears, we take a very real risk. That's why we tend to engage in our most challenging struggles internally, in the dead of night. This book is, among other things, a record of the moment I personally began to wrestle in the daylight. It documents a 2-year period during which I publicly struggled as a congregational rabbi with one of the most difficult and painfully divisive issues facing the American Jewish community. So, just a little bit of biographical. I am a congregational rabbi. I've been at my congregation JRC in Evanston since 1998. And I'm originally from Los Angeles. I'm not one of those people who, I was not most likely to become a rabbi when I was growing up, as my Hebrew school teachers will surely attest. But I did come from a very strongly identified Jewish family. I grew up in a Reformed temple. My family was very active there, and Judaism has always been a very central part of my identity, and Israel and Zionism has always been an integral part of my Jewish identity. I have many friends who live in Israel. I have family members who live in Israel. I've spent a great deal of time there. The first time I visited Israel was when I was about 8 or 9. I've been back more times than I can count. I went through a period in my life where I seriously considered moving to Israel, moving to a kibbutz in particular. And Israel was, as it is for many, for I think generations of American Jews, has a great hold on our sense of what it means to be Jewish today. Even Jews, I often like to say that Zionism, the movement that created a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine, Zionism is in a way a kind of a religion, even for people who aren't religious. It has a religious power to it. It's the narrative of the creation of the state of Israel has a religious power. It's a redemptive story. It's an amazing narrative when you really think about it. It's the story of a people, the Jewish people, for centuries having been hounded out of countries and suffering from persecution, who pray for a return to their homeland, and following one of the greatest cataclysms in Jewish history, the Holocaust, rising from the ashes of the Holocaust, creating this new state, as the national anthem Hatikva of Israel would have it, L'yot am chofshi be'artzenu, to be a free people in our own land. So the first thing I think it's important, especially for non-Jews, to understand about Jews, or at least many Jews, although that the hold of this narrative is starting to change, I think, with newer generations, and we'll talk about that as well, is that it's often difficult for, I meet many people who are not Jewish who wonder why American Jews identify so strongly with this state. And if America is where you're a citizen, what is it about this state that has such a hold on you, and why are you willing to give this state a pass, perhaps, when it comes to certain policies of this state that you wouldn't do with many other states, including the United States? And I think Israel is the repository of just centuries of hopes and dreams and fears and ambitions, and it has a very real hold in ways that we, I think, often don't understand, certainly ways that I didn't understand. To make a long story very short, I spent a number of years in Israel in the mid-'80s. That was around the time that I thought seriously about moving there, joining a group that would move to help live on a kibbutz. That didn't happen. I returned to the United States, finished my studies, and decided to become a rabbi. But I always knew that Israel was always going to be a major part of my own identity, and in particular, the form of Zionism that I identified with was labor Zionism and progressive Zionism. Identified very strongly with the pioneers who moved to the land and settled the land with this socialist Zionist ethic. I also identify very strongly with what I guess you would call the Israeli peace movement. If you're familiar with these different groups, there's Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, and others who were advocating for engagement with the Palestinians to create a two-state, to create a peace process that would end up with a two-state solution. I remember many times marching in marches in Israel to urge on the peace process and the various incarnations of the peace process over the years, and here in the United States as well. I'm old enough to remember that when talking about a two-state solution was considered in the Jewish community just beyond the pale. Talking to Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and those kinds of things were just were considered beyond the border in terms of dialogue in the Jewish establishment. It's interesting how quickly things change. I mean, today, the two-state solution and the peace process is very much the cornerstone of the Jewish communal establishment's approach. At any rate, I think the way I would often frame the issue is that I saw the basic conflict as a collision of nationalisms, of Jewish nationalism and Palestinian nationalisms, two people who had a claim to the same piece of land, and that was the root of this conflict. And the only real solution was to find a way to divide the land up. Similarly to the way that in UN, there were various attempts at partition plans, even before the UN partition plan in '47, and that in order to have a true peace, these two peoples need to find a way nationally to coexist in two separate states. I always had nagging doubts about the way I framed my understanding of the issue. And I think probably if I could describe the most important voice that would sort of speak to me in the nighttime about this issue, that I would always do a really good job of just sort of putting in a box and keeping in the back of my consciousness, was the aspect of Zionism that is really predicated on an ethnic component. That Zionism is about creating a Jewish state, and or at least political Zionism. Zionism, as it's come to be, the form of Zionism that has become ascendant, is predicated on maintaining a demographic majority of Jews in the land. That's one of the basic premises of Zionism and of the Jewish state, was the maximum number of Jews. And I think part of the problem with that, as I would often think, was that that automatically sets up an equation in which non-Jews are a problem. And I could never really wrap myself around that. And I would often find myself sort of falling into that even though I like to think, I like to think of myself as a good liberal who wanted to coexist, that believed that coexistence with Palestinians was important, there was always that sense that the existence of Palestinians was a problem for Zionism, was a problem for Israel. And I think that has led, I believe now, to all kinds of, it's led Israel down a dark road, let's put it that way. And I would entertain that voice for a little while, but I would do a good job of sort of keeping it at bay, I think, because I think if I entertained it for too long, the foundation upon which I created my Jewish identity, I think, would be seriously compromised, to put it mildly. I would often think about when we talked about things like the importance of a two-state solution because there was a demographic threat to the integrity of a Jewish state. And even today, you will hear liberal Jews, people who are proponents, who are good liberal Jews, who are proponents of a two-state solution, people who work for organizations like J Street, for instance. Why do we need to support the peace process in a two-state solution? Because of the birth rate of Palestinians, they're going to outnumber Jews, and that's a demographic threat to Israel. And it wasn't so much the humanitarian issue, it was the demographics of it. And I remember distinctly thinking to myself, boy, if as an American we talked about, other peoples who live in this land as a demographic threat to our Americanness, that would be just incorrigibly racist. I mean, you could never, ever talk about people that way, at least not the people I have dinner with. And I'm sure people do talk that way. But it was somehow okay for, otherwise liberal progressive Jews to talk about Palestinians as a threat to them because of their ethnicity, because of who they were. And again, I didn't think too much about it. To make a long story short, I've said that a few times and I'm elongating it. My thinking evolved over the years, although I really was not able to talk about that evolution as I became a pulpit rabbi. I was ordained as a rabbi in 1992. And I think I dealt with Israel by and large through platitudes. I would say nice, sort of very harmless things about the importance of committing to peace. And without getting too much into specifics, there were many different iterations of the peace process, as I'm sure you know. And each time it was rebooted, I would be on the, I would actively promote be an advocate of the peace process. I know in many congregations, even today, I have colleagues who even going that far is very difficult. Would put their jobs in jeopardy, and it's always amazing to me when I think about how far I've come to realize that even a rabbi who's supporting John Kerry in his efforts right now would be considered even problematic. All it takes is one or a few important members, influential donors of the congregation to disagree with the rabbi, and that creates a chilling effect. And I've been lucky that that's never really been the case for me. But I think up until relatively recently, I never really spoke my true truth on Israel-Palestine. And where that changed, I can tell you exactly when it changed. It changed on December 2008, December 27th, 2008, during Operation Cast Lead, when I read the very, very first reports of Israel's military attack on Gaza. And I remember very distinctly reading about this and thinking that I knew something was happening to me. I knew that this was the breaking point for me and that I couldn't continue along the way that I had. So I wrote a post on my blog, which is the first post in the book, which was sort of the domino that knocked over all the others. And it was relatively short, and I'll read it to you now. The news, this is December 28th, 2008. The news today out of Israel and Gaza makes me just sick to my stomach. I know I can already hear the responses. Every nation has a responsibility to ensure the safety of its citizens. If the Qassams stopped, Israel wouldn't be forced to take military action. Hamas also bears responsibility for this tragic situation. I could answer each and every one of these claims in turn, but I'm ready to stop this perverse game of rhetorical ping pong. I don't buy the rationalizations anymore. I'm so tired of the apologetics. How on earth will squeezing the life out of Gaza, not to mention bombing the living hell out of it, ensure the safety of Israeli citizens? We good liberal Jews are ready to protest oppression and human rights abuses anywhere in the world, but are all too willing to give Israel a pass. It's a fascinating double standard, and one I understand all too well. I understand it because I've been just as responsible as anyone else for perpetuating it. So no more rationalizations. What Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza is an outrage. It has brought neither safety nor security to the people of Israel, and it has brought nothing but misery and tragedy upon the people of Gaza. There, I've said it. Now what do I do? And that last question was sort of what prompted a lot of the comments. The question was sort of misunderstood, I think, by some people. I got a lot of comments, people telling me, oh, you should sign this petition, you should march in this rally, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this. And really, it was a more existential question. It was probably one of the most unguarded things I've ever written. It was really, I was thinking, what do I do, at that moment, I wasn't sure if I could be a rabbi, I wasn't sure, I could say these things out loud. And so it was a very sort of unguarded moment, and I knew that when I wrote that, things would change, and they did. And because I wasn't really just talking about Gaza. I mean, I was, and I became very involved in activism around Cast Lead while it was going on. The real intensive period was December and January. But it was, as I said, the domino that knocked them all down, because really my paradigm on understanding the situation changed forever that day. And that was not about two peoples, this sort of level playing field of two nationalisms who had compelling claims to the same piece of land. It was really about one powerful party and one disempowered party, and the powerful party, quite frankly, oppressing the other. And even today, when I put it that way, it pains me to say that for all kinds of reasons. But I do believe that when we treat this conflict, even calling it a conflict, which I think suggests parity, as some kind of balanced situation between these two parties, we're doing a great disservice to our understanding of it. I don't deny that Israel did what it did in Operation Cast Lead, and its policies going all the way back to even before the birth of the state, because they want security for Jews and for their people. But I think nations have done all kinds of horrible things in the pursuit of security. I think the United States couches its actions in terms of security as well, and that while I don't deny the importance of any government seeking security for its citizens, I think we often turn a blind eye to the oppression and persecution that occurs under the guise of security. And even more important, I think, that you're never going to find true security as long as you keeping other people down. They're going to resist. You know, I mean, that's just history 101. If you persecute people, they tend to resist, often violently. And that really became my my understanding of the situation between Israel and Palestine, and it affected the way I've addressed the issue ever since. I refer to myself as the best way I can refer to myself in the activism I do is that I'm a Palestinian solidarity activist. And often many Jews, when they hear me say that, because they have the zero-sum understanding of the situation, either for Palestinians or for Jews, they interpret that as me turning my back on my people or choosing sides. And what I say is that I think standing with Palestinians is the most Jewish thing I can do. I truly believe, and this is something I wrote about in the anthology that's excerpted in Zionism Unsettled, is that I truly believe I'm motivated by the most sacred aspects of my sacred tradition, which teach me that God stands with the oppressed and demands that I do as well. And the most central story of my tradition, the Exodus story, is a liberation story about an oppressed people rising up and seeking liberation from their enslavement. And that's what motivates on so many levels my understanding of what it means to be a Jew. So by saying I'm a Palestinian solidarity activist, really is for me a true fulfillment of my own Jewish consciousness, spiritual consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean it's not complicated. You know, I mean, on the one hand, it makes things, I think, very clear, which is true, but it also means life becomes very, very complicated. And I mentioned I wasn't sure if I could continue as a rabbi once I went down this road, but I fairly quickly found that I could, for a number of reasons. I'm still very much a congregational rabbi in the same congregation. The Jewish community is really my native habitat. It's my home. I just spoke this morning at Lakeside Congregation in Highland Park. I'm hosted in Jewish venues as well as Christian venues, although probably more Christian than Jewish these days. The Jewish community is still my home, and that's very important to me. One of the reasons I've been able to do that is because I have a very unique and remarkable congregation and the leadership of that congregation when this was going on really dealt with the issue, I think, in a pretty heroic way, rather than freaking out when the president and the board members started getting these calls from congregants saying, "What the hell is happened to the rabbi?" Their approach wasn't to call me up and tell me to stop or to threaten my job or whatever, but basically their approach was, "Okay, well, we have a situation here. How are we going to handle this?" And so we found a way through lots of congregational, intra-congregational dialogue and lots of meetings and bringing in consultants to help us learn how to talk to one another, found a way to coexist together, given that their rabbi now is certainly not the one they hired. The other thing is I found a really important institutional Jewish address called Jewish Voice for Peace that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, whose membership actually bumped in a pretty significant way in the time since Operation Cast Lead. And I can talk more about JVP. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that they do, but thank God for them, because I think that gave me an organization where I could feel Jewishly at home. And I've since helped to found the Rabbinical Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. There's about 40 of us on the Rabbinical Council. I have it's a growing number of rabbinic colleagues who do this work together with me. So I want to read you one more post, maybe two more, to give you a little bit of an idea of how I've come to grips with this new road that I'm going down. So this was written exactly a year later, December 28, 2009. It was exactly 1 year ago that I read the first news accounts of Israel's military assault on Gaza. And then I quote the article that I read from the New York Times. Waves of Israeli airstrikes destroyed Hamas security facilities in Gaza on Saturday in a crushing response to the group's rocket fire, killing more than 225, the highest one-day toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in decades. There was a shocking quality to Saturday's attacks, which began in broad daylight as police cadets were graduating, women were shopping at the outdoor market, and children were emerging from school. The center of Gaza City was a scene of chaotic horror, with rubble everywhere, sirens wailing, and women shrieking as dozens of mutilated bodies were laid out on the pavement and in the lobby of Shifa Hospital so that family members could identify them. The dead included civilians, including several construction workers and at least 2 children in school uniforms. By afternoon, shops were shuttered, funerals began, and mourning tents were visible on nearly every major street of this densely populated city. End quote. Previously, whenever I'd hear this kind of news out of Israel-Palestine, my shock and anguish would be tempered by a familiar voice telling me to calm down, don't overreact, don't forget how terribly complicated the situation is. Indeed, I distinctly recall hearing that voice 3 years earlier when the IDF responded to Hezbollah rocket attacks with a similarly massive military onslaught. This time, though, it was different. This time I didn't hear the voice. Somehow it just didn't seem all that complicated to me anymore. Ideologically speaking, I've regarded Zionism with great pride as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Whoa. Of course, I didn't deny that this rebirth came at the expense of another people. Of course, I recognized that Israel's creation was bound up with the suffering of the Palestinians. The situation was, well, it was complicated. Last year, however, I reacted differently. I read of Apache helicopters dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on 1.5 million people crowded into a 140 square mile patch of land with nowhere to run. In the coming days, I would read about the bombing of schools, whole families being blown to bits, children literally burned to the bone with white phosphorus. Somehow it didn't seem complicated at all anymore. At long last, I felt as if I were viewing the conflict with something approaching clarity. Of course, I think we'd all agree that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is technically complicated. But at the end of the day, there is nothing complicated about persecution. The political situation in Darfur, for instance, is enormously complicated. But these complications certainly haven't stopped scores of Jews across North America from protesting the human rights injustices being committed there. We do so because we know that underneath all the geopolitical complexities, oppression is oppression. And as Jews, we know instinctively that our sacred tradition and our own tragic history require us to speak out against all oppression committed in our midst. I'd suggest that there is anything complicated for us here, it is in the possibility that we might in fact have become oppressors ourselves. That is painfully complicated. After all, our Jewish identity has been bound up with the memory of our own persecution for centuries. How on earth can we comprehend, let alone respond to the suggestion that we've become our own worst nightmare? More than anything else, what I was trying to say in that anguished, emotional blog post 1 year ago was, is this what it has come to? Have we come to the point where Israel can wipe out hundreds of people, whole families, whole neighborhoods, and our response as Jews will simply be to rationalize it away? At the very least, will we be able to stop and question what has brought us to this terrifying point? Have we become unable to recognize persecution for what it really and truly is? Those who know me or read my blog surely know that it has been a painfully challenging year for me. My own relationship to Israel is changing in ways I never could have predicted. Since I started raising questions like those above, I've lost some friends, and yes, my congregation has lost some members. If Zionism is the unofficial religion of the contemporary Jewish community, then I'm sure there are many who consider me something of an apostate. But at the same time, I've been surprised and encouraged by the large number of people I've met who've been able to engage me with these questions, openly and honestly, even if they don't always agree with me. I suppose this is what I decided to do 1 year ago, to put my faith in our ability to stand down the paralyzing complexities, however painful the prospect. 1 year later, I still hold tight to this faith. And I want to add that I have lost some friends and a small number of congregants, but by and large, you know, the fears that caused me to avoid taking this step for so many years haven't really come to pass. I think I have many dear friends in Israel, and you know, there are some who agree with me and are in great anguish about what's going on in the country. There's some who don't agree with me, but respect what I do. And it's been enormously heartening for me because many of these Israeli friends were mentors of mine, Jewish mentors of mine, and it would pain me to even consider that I would somehow have to choose between this new path and these people who were so important to me. I just recently had an Israeli friend who was a roommate of mine before he moved to Israel. He lives in Tel Aviv, and his youngest is still in the army. And he was really very much a very important figure in my life when I was in my 20s and thinking about Israel. And you know, he's a middle-class Israeli now. He left kibbutz, and he happened to be in Evanston and on work, and I had coffee with him, and I hadn't seen him in years. And I was avoiding talking about, you know, I just got back actually from the West Bank, and wrote very explicitly about, you know, what I did there and what our group did, and we marched in a popular demonstration in the West Bank, and so I knew he knew what I was doing, and but I really didn't want to go there with him, and he just brought it up himself and said, you know, I know what you've been up to, and he said, I just want you to know, I follow your blog, I read it, every post, and he said, I want you to know I'm really proud of you. And he said, I can't go there, he said, I wish I could. And this is probably one of the things that pains me the most in terms of what's going on in Israel, is I think there are many like my friend who, I think in their heart of hearts, want to go to this place, but there's just so much despair about what's happened in that country. And many people who are otherwise enormously progressive, heartfelt, caring, compassionate people, they're part of a larger system now that is, I think they realize that it's an infrastructural reality. The injustices that go on there are just part and parcel of everyday life. And they're exhausted. And you know, my friend is a good example of these kinds of people. He says, you know, at this point in my life, you know, if I was starting out, maybe I'd be marching with you, but Israel's my home now. And I respect what he says. I understand it. I'm also very sad about it, because I do believe that I don't think the answer to this problem will come from Israelis. I think the solution will have to be imposed on top of them from externally. And we can talk about movements like BDS and other examples of external pressure. And I don't underestimate for a moment what emotionally what that means. I think many people are unable to go to this place to that understanding that Israel is going to have to be forced to change its ways. It's not going to be able to change its ways on its own, because that brings up all kinds of emotional demons for Jews about the world being against the Jewish people, and the sense of victimization, and many of those old nightmares are sort of coming home to roost vis-a-vis Zionism and the state of Israel. I think for me that's one of the biggest tragedies in addition to what it's done to the Palestinian people of the land, what it's done to us. That this movement that was ostensibly about Zionism, which was about solving the Jewish question, normalizing the Jewish situation, has actually raised a whole host of other issues, of tragic issues that I don't think we have a clue how to handle now that they've been unleashed. So let me say a few words about sort of spiritually where I'm at with all of this. I intimated a little bit about that when I talked about my work as a Palestinian solidarity activist. My own understanding of religion, I think in general, and the function of religion in the world, has been clarified through all of this in very important ways. And by that I mean that I used to think of Zionism as what I referred to it in one of those posts as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. But I think seeing it in using those terms, I think is very, very problematic. I mean, I actually think Zionism is a European movement that has its roots in very much a colonial mindset, not necessarily a liberation movement. Liberation movements traditionally are forged by indigenous peoples against colonization. And the fact that I could even understand it in that way, I think speaks to emotionally what the baggage that we carry around as Jews. But I do believe that the role of religion is mixed into all of this, even for those people who don't consider themselves to be religious. I think religion, often you'll hear people who don't consider themselves religious or who don't ascribe to organized religion. They'll badmouth religion. They'll say very nasty things about religion. They'll say, so much misery has been done in the name of religion throughout history. So many wars, so many killed. If you read the Bible, I remember sitting at a wedding party. I was just minding my own business, and someone found out I was a rabbi, and he said, "That Bible, man, you read the Bible, it's like one ethnic cleansing after another." And I did not disagree, and I could find nice highfalutin exegetical ways of dealing with those stories, but by and large, I think I've come to realize that I don't disagree that horrid things have been done in the name of religion over the years. There's no question. And so one of the things, when I'm trying to develop a Jewish liberation theology, one of my assumptions is, and I'm quoting here from my essay, religion has historically been at its best when it acts prophetically, when it holds power to account, and when it is leveraged on behalf of the powerless, the oppressed, and the voiceless. Conversely, we inevitably witness religion at its very worst when faith becomes wedded to empire, when religion is used by powerful nations to justify the subjugation of others. I think those of us who consider ourselves people of faith need to reckon very, very profoundly with the consequences of wedding religion to empire and to political power and to militarism and to nation-statism. I think that's traditionally when we've seen religion at its worst, when religion is wielded as a weapon by nations against weaker people. And I think my study of liberation theology, I think, has been very helpful in this regard. Religion at its best is when it's used by the powerless as a prophetic means to speak truth to power and to shift power. The civil rights movement in this country is but one of many examples of religion at its best, as I would say. Another example, I think, of religion at its worst is what I would term exceptionalism, and I think this is something that all religions need to reckon with as well. I think Christians need to reckon with, since the time of Constantine, what it's meant to Christianity for once state power and Christianity were fused in its way. I think as a Jew, I'm well aware that Jews were often on the receiving end of much of that oppression. The tragedy of Zionism is that, as I've come to realize it, I think Zionism is in many ways Constantinian Judaism. That's a term coined by Mark Ellis, a Jewish thinker that many of you may have heard of. And I think, sort of in terms of Zionism today, I think Jews are now being challenged to reckon with what it means that our sacred tradition, which was born, I believe, as a reaction to empire, namely the Roman Empire. Judaism, as we know it, was really a reaction to the mighty empires that have oppressed Jews throughout history, and proposing another way, a different way. I think the reason Jews are around today, quite frankly, are because we haven't gone down the road of empire. Mighty empires have come and gone, and we're still here. And I think part of the reason is because we put our faith in a power even mightier than the mightiest empire that history has ever known. So I think we all have to reckon with the Constantinian nature of religion, and I think exceptionalism as well. In other words, the notion that somehow our religion is the correct way, and that our God is the correct God. And I think all religions have their exceptionalist streams. And thinking about this Jewishly, this is what I had to write about that. To put it plainly, a voice that affirms claims of theological superiority in the name of one people cannot be the voice of God. A voice that asserts God's words to humanity was vouchsafed exclusively to the children of Abraham cannot be the voice of God. A voice that looks to the messianic day in which all nations will ultimately serve the God of Israel cannot be the voice of God. In other words, Judaism has its own exceptionalist streams, just like all religions. And I think we all buy into them in ways we don't truly realize. And when I wrote that, I just wanted to say it out loud. I just wanted to say that God is bigger than religion. And exceptionalism is a very human thing. I'm better than you. But if we're really talking about God, we're talking about a universal God who treats all peoples, who is the God of all peoples equally. Doesn't see anybody as more chosen than anybody else. And then in fact, exceptionalism itself is also at the root of so much of the misery that's been wrought in the name of religion. So I think this is, to me, a really important place for dialogue among our various faith traditions, and exploring the ways that Constantinian attitudes and exceptionalist attitudes creep into the ways that we understand ourselves and how they poison our relationships with others. I'm a firm believer in dialoguing about the painful, difficult, tough stuff, and not the how happy are we kinds of dialogue that I like to call them. I think a lot of what passes for interfaith dialogue is really just celebrating all the wonderful things we have in common, which is wonderful, but if that's all it is, then it's ultimately a feel-good exercise. I think we need to rely on the stuff about our own baggage that we struggle with, but also the tension points between our faiths, because not all faiths are the same, and not all believe. We have different kinds of baggage, and they collide with each other now and then. And let's talk about that, as painful as it is, not to convince the other of the right way, or to walk away feeling better about ourselves as a result, but in the spirit of coming together and finding some kind of answer in that fellowship itself. So I've thrown out all kinds of stuff. I think I'll stop here. And I'll stop here. And I would love to have conversation about anything I talked about or anything I didn't bring up that I know something about. I'd be happy to talk about that too. So
first, let us first say thank you very, very much. Yeah, so Brand has agreed to take some questions, and maybe we'll do about a half hour. And I will rely upon all of you to ask questions in the form of questions, and maybe when you ask your question, tell Rabbi Grant who you are. I know we've got many guests today from other congregations and from LSTC, so maybe I'll rely on you to pick so that nobody accuses me of favoritism.
First of all, I do want to thank you very much for expressing your own growth in this journey, because I think it helps us to appreciate how we have been growing along too, and changing our opinions from what we had, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I would hope that we can continue to have these wonderful dialogues. And I'm not going to say any more beyond that, but I just appreciate that because I think that helps me personally.
Thank you.
Could I ask, because we in the back are having trouble hearing, could I ask you to stand when you've got a statement so that everyone can hear?
Okay. Yep. My voice is not so good today, but I just wanted to say that I thank Rabbi personally for sharing his growth along this journey, because I think it helps me personally to understand my own growth and my change in attitudes over the years about how we treat one another. And it makes me think of the old saying about you have to know your history because we may tend to repeat it.
Yes, sir.
My name is Lanny Wilson. I'm a physician, but in this group I'm better known as the husband of Pastor Wilson of St. Mark Mount Prospect Lutheran Church. So I don't want to, I want to be a part of the conversation, but as I was sitting here listening to you, I was thinking of a zinger that I want to throw out to you. Several decades ago, there was a person who was involved in marches, and he was standing up for the oppressed, and as his voice got larger, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got killed. Do you worry at all about your health as your voice gets larger?
No, I didn't until now. No. No, I'm just kidding. That question's bad. You know, no, the opposite is true. I'm amazed. I'm just amazed how many people are willing to engage in this with me, even though they sometimes viscerally disagree with me, but are able to engage in a real way. So, no, it has not been the case. I mean, there's always crazies around for all kinds of issues, but in this case, I think there's a growing constituency of people. I'm not by myself on this. There's a growing constituency of us out there, including many, many young people who just, their assumptions about and framing of the issue is just different. They've inherited a different set of assumptions about Israel-Palestine, and that gives me hope too.
That's very reassuring because we need your voice out there.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
I have a question. In regard to your responsibility as a spiritual guide, going back to the elemental of we become what we do, is it Sirach, or is that part of, that was in a reading this morning and that's why it stuck with me. But to justify the reaction out of fear to oppression, when that has to be part of what you're mandated to communicate for spiritual growth to people, that the tradition is and the instruction is we become what we do.
Right. I think I agree with that, but I also think that I've learned that it's very important to validate people's fear and to make sure that people know that you understand their fear. Because if you just gloss it over or ignore it completely, you're not able to really engage. And I think, you know, politically speaking, as Americans, especially post 9/11, there's all kinds of fear. I think to be Jewish, I think, means to inherit a whole host of fears about the way the world is. And I think, and it's not to say some of them are not, you know, many of them are grounded in something very real. It's not just, you know, abstract. And so, my own parents lived through the Holocaust, and I heard the stories, and I have friends who are children of Holocaust survivors. So I'm not talking about something academic. So I think part of how you engage and ultimately move on this issue is to really make sure that you empathize, and that people know that on some level we share these fears as well, that I'm not jumping over that or dismissing it in any way.
Could you give an example of acknowledging other people's fear and showing me some
Example. Well, and I hope I did a little bit of that today in my talk to you. I mean, I think it means. Let me come back to that. I think a lot of it means allowing yourself to be vulnerable, and modeling that to others. It's not about just saying, I understand your fear, I get where you're coming from. That's maybe on the surface level. I think on a deeper level, it's modeling a way of owning your own fear in a public way, and then being able to move past that. But I'll come back to that when I need to meditate on it a bit longer. Yeah.
In an environment, I guess Dirk Landis, Redeemer Lutheran Hinsdale, in an environment where one side has absolute power, almost absolute power, there's a natural reluctance to give up any of that power because of the ways it makes yourself vulnerable. And then you put that in the middle of a region where even the other side is tearing itself apart and the world views you as being a source of stability, right or wrong. What are the possible steps of productively going forward?
I'm very much a part of a movement that I believe is engaging in those positive steps. There is a growing worldwide solidarity movement that is by and large a popular movement. It's by and large using tactics of nonviolence, standing in solidarity with the popular movement in the West Bank and in Gaza also, Palestinians who are resisting through popular resistance. I think if you look historically, you can come up with examples in which these kinds of popular movements have shifted power and created real change. I mentioned the civil rights movement in this country. I think South Africa is another example of that. And that's why I think BDS